definitely my hometown is okay. There are too many of you to run in one direction, so I'm going to be kind of moving back and forth, and I'll do it, but everybody has the one, it's the best we can do. So, my name is Gemma. Tonight, I will talk about the thing that has been widely advertised and is currently written on the board. So, the way this lecture will work, and the way this series of lectures will work, which I'll tell you a little bit more about at the end, is that there'll be a 1-hour lecture. Please save all of your questions until the end. That being said, there'll be a couple of times I'll probably throw over to you and jump in and give me some answers. So what we're going to cover, this is a brief overview. You can tell me if there's something that you think I'm missing or something you're interested in that I'm not covering. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about what torture actually is, what constitutes torture, and I'll give you some pretty gruesome examples. Many of you filling out the form said that what you wanted out of this lecture was some really good, powerful examples to use in debates, so hopefully I can provide that to you. Secondly, I'm going to talk through the legal status of torture and what the various international and domestic United States laws are that prohibit torture and how that works. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about who is responsible for torture and whether or not people in high level of government administration, for example, George Bush, are legally responsible, perhaps morally culpable for torture. I'm going to talk about whether or not torture is effective and perhaps some examples I can provide you, although unfortunately there are relatively limited examples, maybe fortunately. And finally, I'm going to talk through whether or not torture can ever be morally or ethically justified. So, as you can probably tell, the first 4 parts of the lecture will be very, very heavily critical of torture, and then at the end I'll try to give you an answer about how you might oppose those things I'm going to say in the instance where you are the team that has to advocate for torture in a debate. So let's give a bit of context of why we're doing this particular topic. What happened in 2014 that would warrant us discussing torture? Anyone know the answer? Oh. December 2014. Yep, say it with a loud voice.
The release of the CIA.
Right. Yep, the Senate Intelligence Committee released a report on torture, December 9, 2014. Does anybody know what that report said? I mean, I assume you haven't read all 525 pages, but like you might have read an article about it, maybe? That is the terminology, yes, okay, cool. So it detailed a number of things that were previously not common knowledge. So the first of those being the scale of use of torture. Most people believe that it was relatively rare up until that point, and what this report demonstrated was that it was actually a pretty key fundamental strategy that was used by the CIA, and the second was the nature of that torture. So previous to that, what I will subsequently refer to as kind of like old school torture was pretty much common knowledge, things like waterboarding, but the CIA report revealed some pretty disastrous stuff about new torture techniques that I guess the CIA had handled. So as it turns out, the report is 6,000 pages long. 525 pages of those were released to the public. So the overwhelming majority of the content of the report remains confidential. And obviously the overwhelming majority of the really damning parts of the report remain not seen to the public, and that's probably going to be true for a long time. Some interesting facts: it took 5 years, this investigation that the Senate Intelligence Committee did, and about $40 million, and had to go through much obstruction by the CIA. So we'll talk a little bit about that later on when we talk about whether or not the activities of the CIA are actually illegal, but it is widely acknowledged and accepted. In fact, the chief of the CIA apologized for the fact that during the investigation, the CIA attempted to obstruct investigation by doing things like, for example, trying to tap phones and get into computer data and files and things like that of the investigators. So that's kind of the context of this lecture and the reason we're doing it, the reason why I guess torture as an area of debate has come up very frequently recently. Can anyone name for me a topic that they've heard about or done or seen that's about torture, or for which this lecture might be relevant? Joy, you showed up then.
The one at work,
yeah,
medical treatment, doctors can work kind of
yeah, okay, so at the World Championships, I was talking about the role of doctors. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. Anybody else? Anyone done a debate about torture before? Yes? What was it about? Okay, well, you're very well prepared for debates that you may never do. Okay, so part one, let's talk about what torture actually is, or as it's known in the United States, advanced interrogation techniques. Quite obviously, that's like a strategic ploy from the government to avoid dubbing it torture. So I'm going to talk about torture and not advanced interrogation techniques, but the two things are interchangeable for the purposes of like what we're talking about with regards to the activities of the CIA. So, as I said, some of the more common things that people are probably familiar with are things like waterboarding. Can someone tell me what waterboarding is?
You're kind of suffocated underwater.
Yeah. It's basically an attempt to mimic drowning, that's true, without actually drowning the person involved. Sensory deprivation, so things like, for example, locking you in a very small space with no light, no access to food or sleep, time, those kinds of things are, I guess, relatively, I guess it's sad for me to say, common techniques for torture. Some of the things that were revealed in the Senate report, which I think are worth talking about and might be useful for you in debates, I think are perhaps much more grim. So some of the things that the Senate report revealed were that prisoners had been locked in coffins for extended periods of time to essentially mimic death, that they'd been shackled to walls or hung from the roof by their arms, that they had been forced to stand on broken legs and broken ankles, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later when I talk about the role of doctors. And the final one, which was very controversial and took up a lot of space and a lot of media attention, was anal rehydration. Does anyone know what that is? Anal rehydration.
Shoving water.
Yeah, so basically it's a strategy where they fill your intestines, they inflate your intestines with liquid to induce really significant pain. So that was the one that was incredibly controversial. And the reason for that, and again, I'll talk about this a little bit later when I talk about the role of doctors, is because it does leave a scar and it's very, very hard to detect post-fact. So it would be very difficult for anyone to corroborate the fact that it had in fact happened to you, unlike obviously being shackled to a wall or beaten, bruised, and things like that. So those are the kinds of things we're talking about when we talk about torture. I wanted to make that clear because I think it's important that any argument you make about torture and its validity is grounded in some understanding of what actually takes place, as grim as it may be. Okay, so I said at the beginning that there was a particular context for talking about torture now, given the release of this report. But is torture a new thing, do you think?
No.
Okay, so what are some famous historical examples of the use of torture? Like, where did it begin? I mean, obviously it began in very, very medieval times, and we don't need to talk about that, but more kind of 20th century. Where does most of our current knowledge about torture come from? Yeah, okay, so around the World War II era, so Japanese internment camps is one good example, not good, but one example of the use of torture, and the other is the Nazi experiments. So most of our current understanding of the effectiveness of particular techniques in torturing people comes from experiments that were done by the Nazis on prisoners in war camps. So it's obviously not a new thing. And in fact, it might be kind of frightening for people to realise. I think most people presume that torture kind of begun as a strategy after September 11th, right? That's generally common knowledge. That as a result of the war on terror, we decided to expand the range of things that the CIA could do, and we decided that torture was perhaps justified. But in actual fact, the most significant, most detailed manual of torture techniques in the world was released in 1963 by the CIA, and it's called the Kubark Manual, and it's still today pretty much forms the foundation of the torture strategies of the CIA. So it's actually not really the case that torture was not a policy of the United States prior to September 11th. It is certainly the case that the nature of the torture perhaps changed a little bit, and that the priorities of the government with regards to using torture perhaps changed also. But in general, it's pretty much the case that it's been an ongoing strategy of the United States government for many, many years. This lecture is going to be a little unfair insofar as it targets the US pretty explicitly. That isn't to say that there aren't other governments around the world that don't use torture. Many, many, many other governments do. And in fact, other governments, unlike the United States, have explicit policies that say that they're allowed to use torture. So I guess in that sense, it's kind of nice that the US is least embarrassed about the use of torture. But we're going to talk mostly about them in this lecture. impact of torture, or what I'm going to dub the human face of torture, because it's really easy to talk about things like anal rehydration and locking someone in a coffin in theory, but I think it's important to think about the actual impact that has on people. So, if you were to take a guess, how many people do you think have died in custody since the war on terror began? In the United States custody? Hundreds of thousands. I think we might know about that, to be honest. We've got hundreds of thousands. Okay. Wow. Okay. You guys have a more grim interpretation of the US government than is actually fair. No. So they generally try to avoid killing people. And we'll talk a little more about that later. As I said, that's the reason why they use a lot of the techniques they do. It's actually so that people don't die. It's much, much harder to defend that. So just over 100 detainees have died in US custody collectively in Guantanamo Bay, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq since the beginning of the war on terror. So people are shocked by how low that number is. Obviously, because people were saying like 5,000 and 7,000. Yeah, so we don't actually capture that many that many terror suspects. Probably aren't 5,000 people detained at any given time, I would say, in Guantanamo, thankfully, and the internment camps and other places in the world. Okay, of those 100, the US military has dubbed 34 either confirmed or suspected homicides. What that means is that 34 of those 100, we can pretty much be sure, were actually killed by members of the CIA. The rest of them presumably died in suspicious circumstances, or circumstances that very plausibly were doctored by medical staff. I'll talk through that a little bit later. So, is that shocking to people? I think that's kind of a frightening statistic. Especially, as I said, in the context of a couple of things. The first is, obviously we have to presume that the information we have is not exactly accurate, right? We have to presume that of the people we know about, sure, perhaps it was 34, but plausibly it was many more, and plausibly it was many more than 100. I don't think it was 7,000, but I think it's reasonable to say that it might be more than 100. So I think those statistics are a little bit worrying. And as I said, of the remainder who weren't homicides, many of them probably were, so that's also a little bit frightening. 18 prisoners in Guantanamo Bay have attempted to commit suicide. Many of them have been effective in doing that. In general, obviously, the CIA tries to prevent detainees from committing suicide because that pretty much undermines the impact of the value of torturing them. So obviously, the reason that's less effective is because they generally try to resuscitate people and prevent them from being capable of doing that. I'm quite sure a lot more detainees will commit suicide in the event that they have the capability to do that. So that's something else to keep in mind as well. These people are forced to stay alive, albeit in pretty grim circumstances. Let's talk about how that happens. I apologize again in advance for getting specific, but I think it's important for the sake of, I guess, intellectual honesty, that we know what kinds of things happen. So let me give you a quote from an autopsy report from one of those 34 people who is confirmed to have been killed by homicide, who died from severe blunt force injuries, being hung, and having the obstruction of their oral cavity with a gag. So what that means is something shoved down their throat, being hung up, and being beaten to death. In a United States facility by US officials, right? This is something that's going on today, right now. So I think that's personally pretty grim. And I thought it was worth us talking about that. Have people thought about that before? Like, I know personally that I've done quite a few debates in my time about torture, but very rarely do those debates contain any actual discussion of the nature of that torture or the impact of that torture on the people who suffer, I guess, from it. So I think it's worthwhile us doing that. Okay, let's move on from that, because it's obviously a bit distressing. Is torture illegal? What do you think?
I think that is.
Probably yes. Yeah, pretty much. Okay, so let's talk about the many different ways, I guess, in which torture is illegal, because despite the fact that it's pretty overwhelmingly clear that it is, there's still some contention, especially on the part of the US government, about the question of the legality of torture. So international prohibitions on torture are pretty significant. Does anyone know what laws, what conventions might prohibit torture? Yeah, okay, so one is the Geneva Conventions. Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, that's true. And in fact, Article 31 of the Geneva Conventions both prohibit torture in various different ways. Okay, so what is the significance of that? What do the Geneva Conventions do? Okay, what are you if you break the Geneva Conventions? Let's put it that way. Right, yep. You're a genocider, you're a war criminal. Okay, so these are pretty significant things. These aren't like you just violated general criminal law. This is like you could be prosecuted in the International Criminal Court. Obviously that's not going to happen, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it means that for all intents and purposes, to commit torture is to make you an international war criminal. Okay, it is also true that it is prohibited in many different United Nations conventions. The first of those is the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which should be unsurprising to anyone involved, that prohibits torture. And in fact, the slideshow that I'm using right now, I'll share on the Facebook page tomorrow so you can actually find some of the details, so we don't need to type out everything. So it's prevented there, it's prevented in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is like the subsidiary document to that document. And it's also prevented in many, many different charters. Obviously the first of those, most important, being the Charter Against Torture, which the United States has signed, as have most countries in the world, many of whom still use torture. So in terms of the international law, it's pretty clear that torture is illegal. How about in the United States domestic law? What do people think there? Still probably illegal, or more of a grey area? Yeah, not really. Except that, yeah, some people like to believe that it's a grey area. That's probably not the case. So the first thing is, obviously by virtue of the United States having ratified many international treaties that prohibit torture, they have like created domestic law that suggests they ought not torture, e.g. it's against the law. But importantly, there's also many, many other United States laws that prevent this. So US courts have found in many different cases that there are constitutional protections against, or prohibitions rather, on torture. So there are many different cases that have found violates the 4th, 5th, 8th and 14th Amendments of the United States Constitution to engage in torture. Obviously, as is often the case, there are some interpretation surrounding that. So potentially some legal scholars or judges might disagree, but nonetheless, cases have successfully been launched to suggest that it's unconstitutional to torture. It certainly violates the Bill of Rights, which is also a document that, at least in theory, holds some significance. And so, yeah, it's illegal. I'm going to read out something now that I think probably suggests that the CIA knows that it's illegal and themselves acknowledges that it's illegal. So, in 2002, the CIA sent a letter, circulated internally a draft of a letter that they intended to send to the Attorney General of the United States government, which requested that the Justice Department provide the CIA with a formal declination of prosecution in advance. What that means is they asked for immunity. They said to the Justice Department, we know this thing is illegal, but we'd like you to confirm for us now that you will not prosecute us in the event that we do it and break the law. Right? So that's something that was produced by the CIA very early on. So this is in 2002. And if we remember, 2002 was the beginning of the program that we now refer to as like advanced interrogation techniques. So the CIA themselves kind of acknowledged that what they did was illegal, which I think pretty much suggests that the grey area doesn't really exist. Let's talk about how they managed to construct or misconstrue, I guess, the law to suggest there was a grey area. So they failed to get immunity. That didn't work. That strategy didn't work. And so what they did was something else instead. They went through another channel, like another dodgy channel, and got a number of legal memos written, which are now referred to as the torture memos, which is obviously pretty bleak. They were drafted by the Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel and White House counselors, beginning in about late 2002, which they purport authorized these techniques that they used or made them legal because of some kind of strange interpretations of the law. And pretty much everybody has subsequently resolved that those things were just like actively misinterpretations of the law. So that's what they claim means that they didn't in fact break the law. I guess something that's worth talking about is the extent to which this information about the nature of the activity and the illegality of the activity fed outside of the CIA and into members of the Bush administration. So, and this is a key debate. So one of the topics you guys haven't done, but I've certainly done at the moment, is about prosecuting George Bush and members of the administration for war crimes or some other version of crimes with regards to torture. And so obviously a key question there is how much did they know? So I guess it's important to realise that George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney were both involved in authorising directly key elements of the program and have both subsequently admitted to knowing about the use of those techniques. So Bush came out and said he knew that waterboarding was being used. Something which, as I said, is pretty much quite obviously illegal. There's pretty much no question about it. So one of the common things it said is that the use of torture in the CIA was just a few bad apples. Like a couple of CIA agents kind of got rogue and over-applied pressure, and it wasn't an institutional decision that was made. But hopefully, what I've kind of told you now will be enough to suggest there was an institutional decision, and like key figures both in the government and also in the CIA were responsible for attempting to prevent being prosecuted for making that decision. So it's pretty hard to suggest that they didn't have knowledge of what was going on. Hello, friend. Sit down. Hello, welcome. Okay, so let's talk about that even more, because perhaps there's some question over the exact extent of knowledge. Human Rights Watch, which is obviously like a watchdog, reported on a particular case of somebody having come forward to them and given details about being waterboarded and to other torture whilst in detention in Afghanistan. The CIA intelligence report, the Senate intelligence report, sorry, that was released in December, describes that case having been reported to the government, and also describes testimony of an internal member of the CIA who came forward to the CIA Inspector General, which is like the head of internal inspections within the CIA, came forward with information about the use of torture or techniques that went outside of the scope of the law. That case was referred to the Attorney General's office in 2004, and nothing ever came of it. The Attorney General's office chose not to follow it up, and the victims were never interviewed by the United States government. So they never even spoke to get testimony to find out if they were waterboarded. They didn't care. They claimed there was insufficient evidence to even bother investigating. So, like, it is also the case that many of the specific violations of the law were actually known about and were brought up and raised in various different forums. Human Rights Watch, in fact, over the last 6 or 8 years, has publicly released a number of stories about things that have taken place, which were then subsequently corroborated by the CIA intelligence report. So it seems as though many of them were actually true, and the government and the CIA in general basically chose not to engage with them or care about them or investigate them at all. So I think one of the really important questions in the debate about torture, and in general when you're thinking about torture, is actually a much bigger question about the authority of the CIA and how governments want to interact with agencies that necessarily have to operate outside of the realm of the law, right? So what does the CIA do? Probably should have said something like this. I assume generally it's common knowledge, but perhaps it's not. What is the CIA? What is their job? That's a bit generalist. The Department of Defense is probably more what you would say is responsible for security. What does the CIA do specifically?
Counterterrorism.
Yeah, I think again that's a manifestation of their job, but not the entirety of their job. So it's a central intelligence agency, right? So its job is to collect information on which the government acts. Okay? And the way in which it collects that information is essentially what we're talking about now. So obviously the purpose of torture is to elicit information from the people you're torturing. There are many different ways in which the CIA will go about this. But obviously by virtue of the sensitive nature of the information that's under discussion, the CIA is not subject to most laws that any other government agency would be in terms of transparency, right, or reporting. So in general, the government is accountable, obviously through elections and things like that, but also in a much more direct sense through things like freedom of information requests. So as a member of the public, you are able to essentially make a claim. There's particular piece of information that the government owes you and obligated to give you, and by and large, that's true. With regards to the CIA, it's not true. So almost all of the things they do are confidential. You'll never be able to find out about them. They're not subject to freedom of information requests or pretty much any other scrutiny. The CIA doesn't have to report information the same way as other departments of government do. So most other departments of government will report to the Senate, and like Congress would have some idea of what's going on. The CIA reports directly to the president. right? So the executive is the authority over the CIA rather than the Congress or the Parliament. Obviously, this happens outside of the United States, the same thing is true. So most other countries also have some intelligence gathering arm, which is also not subject to oversight, essentially. So I guess it's something I want you to think about, because I think one of the biggest questions with regards to how we resolve the use of torture is actually more of a question of what we do about the CIA and whether or not it should be subject to law. Okay, so let's talk about CIA obstructionism. So we know for a fact that the CIA lied to Congress and the White House on many different occasions throughout the war on terror. It's like actively misled them. There's some question over whether or not, as I said, members of the executive knew and were complicit in the misleading of people in Congress. And in fact, after the intelligence report was released, I'm not sure if anybody read articles about this, but a number of congressmen actually came out and said that they'd asked for information and were denied access to information or were actively lied to about things that were subsequently found in the report. So obviously it is definitely true that the complicity of just general members of the government is probably pretty limited, given the lack of oversight that they had. However, some people did know. So let's talk about that. So at the direction of the White House, the Secretaries of State and Defense, those two different people, both key members of the National Security Council, which is theoretically like the key decision-making body with regards to security issues, were not briefed on the program, Advanced Interrogation Techniques, that program, until September 2003, which was over like 18 months after the program had begun. So people whose theoretical job it was to hold the CIA accountable didn't even know the program existed in the first 12 to 18 months of its operation. And there's a CIA email that was found and was reported on in the Senate Intelligence Committee report that said Colin Powell, who was the Secretary of State at the time, would quote blow his stack if he were to find out, or if he were briefed about what was going on. So there was active decision making in the CIA to not inform people who wanted to be informed about what was going on. So I guess that's one counter example in terms of whether or not the government was complicit in the use of torture. Certainly members of the government were not briefed in the way that they ought to be. That being said, obviously these people were briefed in 2003. It's hard to tell why things didn't change and kind of haven't really changed already in 2015. The Senate Intelligence Committee, so the group of people that have released this report in 2014, which is the oversight body that can investigate these decisions, was briefed about the program in 2006, about 3 hours before George Bush was forced to disclose the information to the public because of a number of investigations that had taken place and a couple of journalists had got some information. So pretty much the moment at which George Bush revealed information to the Senate Intelligence Committee was the moment at which his hands were completely tied, and he had to, and so they had to get in front of the story. So I think that's a little bit concerning as well. And as I said, in terms of thinking about the role of the CIA and how obstructionist they are, the chair of the Senate committee has reported that they spied on staff computers, and the CIA Inspector General, again, the person responsible for internal accountability within the CIA, referred that matter to the Justice Department, again, and they declined to prosecute. So when the CIA attempted to obstruct the investigation that took place, and we have evidence they attempted to obstruct, the Justice Department's response was, well. So that's pretty much a level of oversight that you can expect with the CIA, which I personally find to be a little bit frightening. And I guess it's worth saying that, like, obviously tonight we're talking about torture. There are also many different other things we can talk about that have very similar frightening overtones. So what else have we learned about recently? Thinking specifically about the CIA and things they've done to get intelligence. Someone named me the other major programs. Yeah, what about it? Right, yeah, okay, exactly. So this, yeah, so torture is certainly not the only way that they go about getting information, and it's also certainly not true that CIA exclusively violates the rights of non-US citizens. It also very regularly, as a matter of course, violates rights of US citizens in many other ways. We don't have time to talk about that tonight, but it's worth knowing that a lot of these questions about the CIA are relevant in many different debates. So, we're pretty convinced it's illegal, what they did? Yeah? Quite convinced people? Okay. How much do we think the government is responsible for? Not members of the CIA? Members of the Bush administration? Let's do a show of hands. Put up your hand if you think George Bush is responsible. usually held accountable. Okay. Hands up if you're like a Bush sympathizer. Yeah, that's probably true. Okay, so let's talk about that. Will we ever prosecute? Will anything ever come of this? Obviously, I've given you some pretty significant examples of where nothing has come of reports very recently. So is there any hope? The answer, no, not really. So, first of all, many civil lawsuits have been filed against the Bush administration and members of the Bush administration. So one very prominent one was filed by an Iraqi woman against the Bush administration a few years back, and was very quickly thrown out of court as being completely unjustified, having no hope of success. So looks like any civil remedy is pretty unlikely. E.g., any individual victim suing the government to get compensation, pretty much a no-go. Let's talk about whether or not criminal prosecution of Bush or anybody else is likely. So one country very recently indicted and convicted in absentia Bush and 7 other members of the administration. 10 points if you can name that country. Pardon? Have a crack.
Is that us?
Yeah. Yeah. So Malaysia went completely rogue and just decided why not, and so they held some trials and they probably found guilty of the Bush administration, which is really cool. So this happened in 2012. It's absolutely meaningless. Unfortunately, Malaysia, sorry, it's meaningless. However, it's cool and suggests that maybe there's hope that sometime in the future, perhaps more politically influential countries might do something that's similar. So what's the impact of that? Let's talk about it. So it's not completely meaningless, right? It's not just a meaningless gesture. What is the impact of Malaysia having found them guilty? Yeah, so there's maybe a question about precedent. There's maybe a question about encouraging other countries to do something similar that are perhaps not as favorable towards the US or not as aligned in relation to the US. Okay, what else?
Awareness.
Yeah, okay, maybe. So it sends a pretty definitive message that they're criminals. This is the minds of Malaysia. Law-abiding Malaysia. Sure. Okay, what else? Does it have any impact on Bush?
He was in a country at the time. Talking about the rule of law.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so obviously, it makes it a little bit problematic for him to travel to Malaysia because he's a convicted criminal here. So Bush and the other members of the administration cannot come here anymore, which is probably really sad for them. Can't go on holiday here in Malaysia, or talk about the rule of law and other kind of ironic things. So that's pretty much the closest we've gotten to any actual prosecution, which is a bit pathetic and sad in my personal opinion. Let's talk about whether or not that has any hope of expanding. So I'm not sure if anybody saw the news. There was not a hoax, there was kind of a very serious misinterpretation of some facts that led to a real buzz in the media not long ago, which said that the reason Bush and other members of the administration had cancelled travel plans was that the German government had indicted them for war crimes or crimes in regards to torture. That wasn't true. The German government hadn't done that. Probably unsurprisingly. The reason that story leaked, or the reason that story got around the news, is because a number of very prominent right advocacy groups and civil society groups in Germany have been pressuring the German government to indict them for these crimes and to prosecute them. So obviously, again, there's a question about the effectiveness of an individual country choosing to prosecute Bush, but in a world in which many different individual countries engage in that action, found guilty, it would probably have some relatively reasonable effect. But obviously, there are many reasons why Germany probably won't do that. For example, it wants to maintain its relationship with the United States, and in a world in which the US itself has pretty much declined to really prosecuting, it seems a little bit like any allies of the United States would be fairly unlikely to prosecute as well. So let's talk about that. Obama. So we've done a lot of writing for Bush, and that's probably fair because he's not a good person. Let's talk about Obama. He's a hero, right? Everyone likes Obama. So let's think about that. Obama, pro or anti-torture? Yeah, anti. Yeah, okay, cool. So what's some of Obama's key campaign platforms? Yeah, right. I will shut down Guantanamo Bay. That. Does anyone know if Guantanamo Bay is in fact shut?
No.
Yeah, right. It's not. That's true. So, and he's been in office how long now? 6. Yeah, it's almost 6 years, I think. Okay, so it's probably long enough to shut down one camp in Cuba if you wanted to, I'd say. So if you scale back, whatever that is, so there might be less people being tortured there now, which is nice. So let's be a bit more specific. On his second day in office, like his first full day in the White House, he signed an executive order closing the CIA's detention facilities. Followed through on that really effectively, as you can tell. What else do you know about Obama? Despite all of these reports, despite the fact that we now have evidence that would be sufficient to find many members of the Bush administration, and in fact, many people who are still employed in the CIA right now, guilty of crimes, not one single person has been investigated, indicted, prosecuted, right? Nobody, no one. And Obama has actually said on many occasions that he doesn't intend to do that. Talk about why that is in a couple of seconds. Actually, let's talk about why that is right now. So why would Obama not, despite obviously being a real crusader and like a protector of human rights and claiming that torture was bad, why would he not choose to prosecute? What do you think? Come on, think it through.
Like Congress, maybe politically unsound.
Yeah, okay. So might jeopardize his other political priorities. Yeah, that might be true. Like might make Republicans hate him slightly more than the maximum. Yeah, okay. Although like, I'm not convinced about that, especially in the world in which like, I don't know, there's a question how much worse it could get. But yeah, okay, maybe certainly early on, that's probably true. You might be a bit more optimistic about his chances of like actually being able to pass policy or run a government. Okay. What about now? So Obama's on the way out, right? Can't be re-elected. Yep. Got nothing to lose. Why not now?
Because he's still doing torture.
Right, yeah. I reckon that's one reason. Probably because he, in my opinion, doesn't want to establish some legal precedent that will turn around and convict him. Because he, in fact, has head of government that was knowingly engaged in torture. And despite claims that, like, he's wanting to, and as I said, has scaled back activities in Guantanamo Bay, it's pretty much widely accepted that some torture has happened even under Obama's administration. So, like, perhaps it's not wise from a personal perspective to, like, establish any precedent about, yeah, putting people in jail. Okay, what else? Why is it that members of the CIA, like the leadership of the CIA, who were the architects of this policy, remain in their positions?
Then I think it's valuable.
Right. Yeah. Maybe the answer is that Obama thought it would be really effective political strategy to hate on Guantanamo Bay and George Bush, but actually recognizes that there is some strategic value in engaging in torture, right? So wanted to have his cake and eat it too. And I think that probably is the actual answer, right? Especially because when the election took place for Obama, it was in the wake of all of that hype in the media about things that had happened at Abu Ghraib. Those pictures have been released, right? I'm sure everybody, or most people in the audience, have seen those pictures. And there was news story after news story of US officials, both in terms of like in the CIA facilities, but also US officials, military personnel in Iraq and Afghanistan, like doing really incredibly horrendous things. So it probably was pretty unpalatable at that time to come out and be a torture supporter. And generally probably is. So I'd say that is probably the answer. And we're going to come to, in very shortly, a question about whether or not it is justified. And you have to think at a certain point when members of governments all over the world continue to use it, maybe there is some merit in using torture, which we haven't yet identified. Let's quickly talk about complicity and whether or not people outside of the government have it. So let's talk about doctors and their role. As we spoke about earlier, this was talking about the World Championships very recently was held in Malaysia. So doctors participate in the process in many different ways, and I think it's really important that it's not misinterpreted. A lot of people think that doctors participate exclusively in like giving care to people who have torture done. That's actually not true. Two of the key designers of the current torture strategy or of the enhanced interrogation technique strategy were like members of the American Psychological Association, like signed up paid members who are psychologists. who were paid a lot, like $1.8 million, for their contribution to coming up with how to break people down and giving insight into like the psychological impacts of the various techniques that were being proposed. So it's actually not true that they're like kind of passive observers. It's also true that many doctors and psychologists and medical professionals have been involved in designing this program and carrying it out. It is also true that many of these techniques like would be impossible without the continued participation of doctors, right? So obviously it's pretty easy to beat someone to death without a medical degree. That's true. It's not easy to do torture techniques that A, don't leave a mark, and that B, don't kill people, right? And so this is the role of doctors, and I think that we should be specific here. Many of the techniques that are like part of this current incarnation of torture are unique insofar as they, as I said, are very hard to detect and they keep you alive. So the fatalities have actually gone down significantly. And the reason for that is the participation of doctors. So it's like, on the one hand, you might make an argument that it's a good thing, right? Less people have died, and perhaps torture has been more controlled. Yeah, true. Like doctors' job is to keep people alive, and they've done that. Does that resonate with people? Like, does that seem true? No? Maybe? Okay. So why would it be a bad thing? Let's say the alternatives are these people are going to die. Right? Let's say doctors not participating, definitively meant more people would end up dead. Is that a preferable situation? Does anyone think?
Yeah.
Okay, why?
Because of the psychological and
Okay, so maybe these people are better off dead, which is a really cold, hard thing to say. But I think the suggestion that it's a good thing to continuously be brought back to life and kept alive in detention facilities so you can be tortured forever and ever is probably quite a bad thing. Yeah, true. Which is probably indicated by the fact that so many people who've been detained have attempted to take their own life. Suggestion probably not unreasonable that life isn't really worth living. Okay, what else? What's the impact of not having fatalities and not having bruises? Right. Yeah. So it makes it much, much harder for us to, and the public, to investigate these things and gain information about these things and pressure the government to change behaviour. Right? So this is like a really interesting debate because I think it's a real question of how utilitarian you are, whether or not you're willing to sacrifice a few to save many. And I guess that the answer is if people are bruised and bloody and if people die in custody, it's actually much harder for the CIA to hide those things. And it's probably likely that there would be photos and there would be public outrage about those things. Obviously, there's a question about whether or not public outrage would have done anything. And the answer is probably not, right? Because there's been so much public outrage, and despite that, we pretty much continue to torture people as if, like the public were okay with it and were fine with it. So perhaps it wouldn't have done anything, but I guess it's worth thinking through the role of doctors and whether or not you think it's right for them to engage in that. So let's be clear about some things that, for example, the doctors have designed. So when they waterboard people, traditionally, obviously, they would do it with water, thusly waterboarding. Not to make jokes about waterboarding, I guess. But the advanced interrogation techniques that are used in the current US facilities actually use medical saline, which is the thing they put in a drip, right, when you go into the hospital. Yeah, saline, which is the thing that they give you when you're sick. Yeah, and the reason for that is because it gives you, like, the reason they give it to you in hospital, right, is to prevent you from losing electrolytes and to keep you healthy. So the reason they use medical saline now when waterboarding people is because it means they're less likely to die as a result of ongoing exposure to waterboarding. So, like, there are many very specific things that the government and the CIA would never have known, would never have changed without the participation of doctors, most of whom paid very significant amounts of money. So I think that's worth just considering. And obviously, as I said earlier, it's probably unlikely that we'll ever prosecute members of government, but there are many ways in which other independent bodies might go about trying to regulate this. So, for example, there's an argument that the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, should deregister people who are found out have been complicit in torture, and that's like one of the debates that's going on right now, whether or not the medical community should independently take a stand against torture, which they have, I guess, in words, but perhaps not in action. The other thing I was going to say is, I'm not sure if this is like common knowledge or if this is interesting to people, but over 8 different countries have been complicit and have cooperated with the United States to torture people over the past 15 years. So the United States, as probably most of you know, it doesn't torture people in the United States, right? They just don't take them down into like New York City and torture them there. Okay, why? Flights are too expensive? Like why? What reason?
So that you don't get caught.
Right, okay. Because obviously the closer home it is, the more oversight there is. It's much easier and much more effective to conduct torture in places where there is very limited oversight. Which is why the places we're talking about, Guantanamo, which obviously isn't in US soil, camps in Iraq and Afghanistan, are far more likely to be used. Let's think about some other countries that have offered space and have also cooperated with torture. Thailand, Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, many different countries around the world have either hosted US personnel who we know to have been engaged in torture, or themselves have had people engage at the direction of the United States with torture. So it's also the case this is a pretty widespread problem, as I said earlier, and it's not just the United States who is responsible. So we're going over time a little, so I'm going to try to hurry up. Does torture actually work? Who in the room thinks torture is effective at getting information? Like, let's start off now and see how we go. So we can, yeah? So like, very few people are willing to like say torture works. Okay. So the first thing that I want to say, and I think this is important for any debate to be, or any debate arguments about the effectiveness of torture, is structurally very difficult for us to make an assessment of the impact of torture because we don't have access to the information that it produces, right? So by necessity, it is very hard for us to make any kind of quantitative or qualitative assessment of the information that is given out, okay? And that doesn't necessarily mean the information isn't valuable, right? So obviously one perspective is that that information really isn't valuable and the government claims it to be valuable and we can then interrogate the fact that it's not. The other is perhaps it's really valuable but the government cannot tell us because it's of strategic importance, right? So I think that's open to debate and both of those things are equally valid, I think, as logical arguments. But let's talk about some examples where it might have been effective. So Time and a bunch of other major news corporations, as well as the United States government, reported a case where the US detained and subsequently tortured, obviously, one of the major officials in the Al-Qaeda administration, who was known as Sheikh Mohammed. And there were many claims by the government and otherwise that he gave over really significant information about the operational plans of Al-Qaeda over other key figures, and many arrests subsequently took place of other key leaders in Al-Qaeda. Like in terms of the time frame, this guy is detained and then a few months later many other people are arrested. So again, hard to tell, right? Perhaps that was a coincidence, perhaps the information is absolutely useless and we just happened to like find these people on our own, or perhaps this guy was really useful, but we'll never know, right? That's kind of the reality of the situation. So let's think about it logically, even factually speaking, charged with that. Why might it be effective?
You did say that psychologists design the technique, right? So
Yeah.
you have a better insight of the psychological
Yeah.
state of
Yeah. True, and like the way the techniques operate now, they keep your life look much longer. So we can torture you for a lot longer than we used to be able to until you just kind of die again. So yeah, maybe it works a bit more effectively now. Maybe we have more information about the kinds of ways that the human mind can be broken down and crushed. That's true. Okay. Why do you think, just from a logical perspective, it's probably unlikely to be effective?
The information could be outdated.
Yeah, okay. So there's like a time lag problem. Maybe, yeah. What else?
terrorism.
Yeah, right. So what's unique about terrorists? Obviously torture is very rarely used in any other circumstances, right? What's unique about terrorists is obviously that they're trained to withstand torture. The part of becoming a terrorist is that you know that you are likely to be tortured and that part of your training and part of your life goal is to withstand torture, right? And not give out information. And perhaps you're motivated by a far higher God, perhaps therefore physical pain and the threat of death doesn't affect you, right? For someone who's willing to give up your life, like engaging in suicide attacks and things like that, perhaps like torture doesn't really get to you. Although it's a little different, right? I think this is important to note as well. The fact that you're willing to die doesn't necessarily mean you can withstand ongoing psychological and physical deprivation. Because the two things are kind of not necessarily interchangeable. I think it's really important to point that out because I think it's very common in debates that people say, but they're terrorists, they're going to die anyway, and that's like not sufficient, I don't think, to make the argument effectively. So whether or not it works, we're not sure. Let's answer the final question that I wanted to talk about, and we'll get to the Q&A. We'll test whether or not any of your opinions have actually changed. Therefore, knowing everything that we know, Do you think torture can be justified? Let's do a quick show of hands. Put up your hand now if you think there are circumstances in which torture is justified and could be considered ethical or moral. Oh, many. Wow, okay. Has anyone changed their mind? Just put it right at the bottom. What did everyone who put up their hand now walk in thinking yes? Okay, let's talk about it. So, and this, you'll now start to see why I asked you some of the questions I did on the form originally. Everybody, is anyone in the room a pacifist? Like believes we should never go to war? Okay. Yeah, make love not war, something like that. Yeah. Okay. So maybe I'd say that almost all of you in the room accept that there are circumstances in which war is justified and war to engage in armed conflict. Yes? Everybody pretty much agrees? Okay. So let's go to part 2. War inevitably has collateral damage. Yes? It is possible to engage in an armed conflict that kills innocent people. Yep, just true. So of course we can minimize the number of people who are killed. Of course we can design wars in such a way that not heaps and heaps of innocent civilians are killed. We try to avoid them dying, but it's impossible to do any armed conflict where innocent civilians are killed or maimed. All right. So what's the difference? This is an interesting question because actually a lot more of you said that you think torture is okay than what I expected. So perhaps you don't think there's a difference. So I'd say that most people, if I asked them, the general population, would probably feel pretty uncomfortable with the suggestion that torture is okay. But almost everybody, if you ask them, would suggest that military conflict is justified. So is there something like from a moral or ethical perspective that differentiates the two? If we're willing to like drop a bomb on your wedding and like kill and maim innocent women and children who have nothing to do with terrorism, why aren't we willing to torture terrorists?
Maybe because it's something of someone who is collateral damage or is probably shorter than someone who is damaged by torture.
Maybe that presumes like a best case scenario, right? That we like kind of walk into a village and shoot you in the head, rather than you happen to be like maimed, yeah, or like you happen to get shrapnel poisoning, or you know, you happen to be the victim of like chemical weapons burns, things that like last forever and ever. You happen to live in a village where the water supply is polluted by virtue of the conflict that goes on, and then everybody in the village gets cancer and dies. Like I reckon it's a pretty, I agree, I reckon that's one thing people might say, like the quickness or the preciseness of the pain, but I think that's probably inaccurate as well. I'd say that in general, people who are hurt in wars are like not necessarily killed swiftly, especially given we know that a lot of other really terrible things happen in war. Like sexual assault is still incredibly common in armed conflict. Like many children watch their parents get shot, and so perhaps they're not physically in pain, but I'd say the psychological devastation of seeing everybody in your village shot and killed is probably equivalent to the psychological pain of going through torture in an official establishment. So I guess what I would say, and I think the other differentiation we might attempt to make is the effectiveness, right? So people who are utilitarian might say, yeah, of course we can trade off your right, but armed conflict is far more likely to have an effective outcome for you, the people, as distinct from torture where they claim is effective, right? This is the whole we don't get any information that's useful argument. But again, it doesn't really seem to be like a very significant moral ethical argument, because we don't know for a fact that torture will not be successful, and similarly, we don't know for a fact that armed conflict will be successful, right? So it doesn't really seem like a good reason to believe one of them is moral or can be justified and one of them cannot be justified. Especially, I think this is the important consideration, where engaging in torture might in fact prevent collateral damage in war. Like we might not have to engage in an armed conflict if, for example, they can prevent things before they happen. So I guess hopefully, and we've like run a little over, so we'll take questions in a second. Hopefully the purpose of this is to suggest that like, whilst it very much seems, I think in the media and if you read anything, that the case against torture is pretty much done, made, and dusted, like there's no question about it. I don't necessarily know that things are that black and white. Now obviously I personally don't agree with torture, and this is what I'm saying, that I've constructed this argument, but I don't think it's true. Similarly, I probably don't think we should engage in armed conflict, but I think that if you will accept one, you probably ought to accept the other. I think that that's probably a useful way of framing things in a debate, because I think it is very hard to make a logical argument that says we can or ought to live in a world in which no armed conflict takes place, right? Obviously, we can push people's ethics to the boundary. What happens if a genocide is taking place? Do we sit by and let it happen? And this is, to be fair, a question that's been asked. And like pacifists, if their opinion is taken to the extreme incarnation, would say, yeah, we sit by. People report to commit mass suicide instead of being killed, and like that's where we want to respond to the potential threat of death rather than fighting back. So I reckon that's a pretty untenable position in a practical sense and also ethically. I think it's like a pretty untenable position personally. So I think if you can justify one, you can justify the other. Alright, so that was pretty much all I wanted to talk about. As I said, the slideshow I used and some sources and stuff on the Facebook page. But before I get to talking about some of the things that are upcoming, anyone have any questions? Arguments they've heard, debates they're not sure about how they would run particular arguments, or enhance which they're not sure about? Yeah.
I'm just curious, right? If torture techniques were not successful, then why are they still happening?
Yeah.
What's the incentive for them to happen if it's not successful?
So I think there are a couple of, that's a really good question. And that's a good question you could pose to someone in debate. There are a couple of answers that might justify their continued existence even if they're unsuccessful. The first is that I think you can make the argument that many members of the CIA and people who are responsible for torture have kind of gone rogue on power, right? These people are unaccountable. And like if you think about the Abu Ghraib example, right? Where it was like individual members of the US military who just like went mad and groupthink and therefore decided they would just like commit violence against people randomly. I think you can kind of make the argument that filters up as well, in the same way that like individual soldiers go crazy and like shoot random Islamic women because they decided that that's what freedom like suggests they ought to do. I think the same argument can probably be made, which is that there are members of the administration who also feel like essentially stuff you, like you're a terrorist and we will do this to hurt you, as opposed to we're doing it for some effective reason to get information out of you. The second is that it might be a easy way out. Like you might make the government feel as though they're doing something effective to fight terrorism, when in actual fact they're not, because trying to engage in a proper counterterrorism strategy, where you, for example, like develop the economies of countries and you give them aid and you try not to like hate their religion, that's actually a really hard thing to do, right? Like other counterterrorism strategies. So everybody's probably heard of like the hearts and minds strategy, right? In the post-Iraq era. Okay, so pretty much the US figured out that their strategy had been all wrong. They decided that the way around the kind of huge chaos that they created was to win over the people on the ground, right, in Iraq, and make them believe in freedom and want democracy, all that kind of stuff. So that stuff is really hard to do, yeah? It takes a really long time, it's often ineffective. So maybe it's seen as an easier way of combating those problems than trying to do what's right, which is to prevent terrorism at the grassroots rather than subsequent down the track. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
Can I get your opinion on the second question? There's supposed the use of torture in specific ticking time bomb scenarios.
Yeah, so that's good. You talk about the ticking time bomb. So that's like the most common, I guess, ethical dilemma with regards to torture, right? The idea that there is a bomb going to go off somewhere, like in downtown New York, going to kill many thousands of people, and you've got a guy who's pretty sure has information who you torture more than you. That's like a common thought experiment that attempts to expose whether or not you would consider torture to be justified. So I think in those circumstances, it is also plausible that the effectiveness of torture is greater as well, in as much as it is usually the case that you found a person who has a pretty good idea of the information that they know, and it is presumably in quite a short time period. So obviously there are two different types of torture that take place. You sometimes detain people to torture them over a long period of time, in hopes that they'll reveal like structural information, right? They'll tell us who the leaders of organizations are, or like how Al-Qaeda communicates, things like that, right? So there are also people who be detained who need to have certain information about a key event that's going to happen, like now. And so that's kind of the ticking time bomb scenario. I think in that case, it's probably more likely the information is effective, but who knows? I mean, it is very plausible still that it has no effect whatsoever. People don't speak before they realize. So it's hard to tell. But obviously, part of torture, and I should say this as well, which is the part of torture techniques also include giving things like truth serums, and often include giving people who are being tortured heroin or LSD or other psychotropic drugs, which essentially remove your capacity to like to lie essentially, right? So, and to think straight. So you just kind of babble and then take information out of that. So it is often the case that even if you want to lie, you might be chemically altered such that you're less than capable of doing that. So maybe that makes it more effective for you guys. Yeah, actually let's go down here.
Okay, so is torture really the best way to gain intelligence, or could there be other alternatives?
Well, you tell me, what else could you do to find out information? So one of them I mentioned already, right? Which is the hearts and minds thing. And the way that strategy works is the US, or General Petraeus, who is the key leader of this thing, said if people in the community like us and they believe what we're doing, then they'll come forward with information, right? They'll volunteer information because they'll want to cooperate with us. So the idea was, if we go into like a small Iraqi village that might be housing a terrorist, right? There might be terrorists operating in that village, and we know about that, and people are keeping quiet about that. And those people agree with what we're trying to achieve, and they're not afraid of us, and they think we're friends, then they'll come forward voluntarily with that information, right? So maybe that strategy is more effective, perhaps. That's true. Maybe embedding people in terror cells, which is another thing that the United States is attempting to do. So send like operatives, obviously not like members of the CIA, like looking all American and stuff, but like particular types of people try to embed in terror cells. That's another thing that the US is attempting to do. And obviously the US cooperates with a number of other countries that might have access to greater intelligence. So the biggest one of those is Israel, who obviously has, in a geographical sense, much more direct access to intelligence than the Middle East, which is obviously where the overwhelming majority of US focus is in terms of gaining intelligence. So a lot of the US intelligence that is used in the war in Iraq has actually come from Mossad, which is the intelligence agency of the Israeli government. So yeah, cooperating with other countries as well might be another way. Okay, good question. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead.
What are the trade-offs of removing the citizenship of people who join terrorist groups?
So like the whole should we prevent people going to join ISIS thing. I'll come back to you because I think that's kind of not necessarily related to what we're talking about, but if we have time, I'll answer that question for you as well, okay? Because we don't have to on ISIS always. And I've got anything that's more directly related to torture, and okay, go for it. Yeah, you. Yeah.
Regarding terrorists who are actually tortured, right? I was wondering, right, whether are there people who actually suspected terrorists who actually are tortured, or are we only talking about terrorists?
Absolutely not. There are innocent people who are tortured. There are people who like kind of look Islamic who are tortured. People who are called Muhammad that we assume might be terrorists are tortured. Like, yeah. So I think it's really important to recognize that any program of torture will obviously involves some torture of people who turn out to be innocent and turn out to not be anything, right? It's impossible. If you're not going to give these people a fair trial, you don't know what information they have, you can't confirm who they are before you torture them. That's the purpose of torturing in the first place, right? So necessarily it is true that any program you construct will always do that, right? But it's also true, right, that most governments on earth engage in extrajudicial killing. Like, it is true, like, we killed Osama bin Laden, that guy didn't have a trial, and we can always say Osama bin Laden was guilty, but there are obviously there are far more grave cases than Osama bin Laden, like people who don't have necessary documented evidence. Osama bin Laden, we could have made a case against in a court of law and he would have been found guilty. That's just true. But we kill many people all the time in wars and in attempts to fight terrorism who, in fact, may not be guilty. And so, again, it's a question about whether or not you're willing to draw those ethical lines. Absolutely, you're torture people right now. Yeah, for sure. And also, like, there's a broader question, which is, does knowing information make you guilty of a crime? Like, maybe, maybe not. So obviously, sometimes we torture people who don't know anything at all, and that's obviously an error in terms of it's ineffective and it's also wrong. But then, like, just by virtue of you having witnessed something go on in your neighborhood, or just by virtue of having to, like, live in a really terrible community that might be, like, overrun by terrorists, does that make you ethically responsible? Does it make you, like, does it give us reason to torture you? I don't know. So even in cases where you might actually have information that would be useful in prosecuting or in finding or in killing a terrorist, again, the ethical question is difficult to answer. Alright, any other questions? Yeah.
Do they ever get released?
Yeah. Yeah, all the time. That's how we know they're tortured. It's just we don't really listen or care. So yeah, all the time. I mean, obviously major terrorist leaders, like people who are second in charge in Al-Qaeda, we probably don't. To be honest. So that Sheikh Mohammed guy that I told you about, we don't even know where that guy's in custody. right? Like we don't have the information. We don't know how long he's been in custody. There's like a lot of speculation about when he was actually down. So like key leaders, I think it's probably true that they're going to be in some dark dungeon forever. But people who, as I said, we bring in for a very specific reason, like they have particular information about certain cell or a certain thing, generally are released. And like there are many victims of US torture that have been released and have come forward to the media, have spoken to things like Human Rights Watch, or have even gone to the US government, as I said, have like tried to make legal cases against them. So that's how we have the information. Which is obviously, as I said, intimately linked with why the United States wants to operate torture in the way that it does, to make it far less obvious if those people or when those people are released back in public. Okay, anyone else? If not, I'll come back to your question. Alright, this will be the final. So what did you say? What's the trade-off with removing people's citizenship? I don't know. Like insofar as is your question like what do you lose? Because like, I personally think it's probably the right thing to do. Like in the event where you think somebody in your state is like complicit with your enemy, like people who you are fighting who form some kind of existential threat to the safety of the rest of your citizenry, it's probably not completely unreasonable to revoke their citizenship. I guess the question again, trying to draw a parallel, is whether or not you would do something similar to like a convicted criminal. Like people who've obviously posed a direct threat to your society, and it's obviously not true that like serial killers lose their citizenship. I don't necessarily think that's like a particularly compelling example though, because like perhaps they should. Like I would be particularly devastated if this is, you know, serial killers and absolute psychopaths like had their citizenship revoked. So, and I think more broadly the impact, right, of taking away citizenship is that they can't get back into your country. They find it very difficult to come back. So there's also potentially a safety dimension, right? Insofar as you prevent whatever impact they might have directly coming back to impact upon you. So this is something we talked about recently in Malaysia, right? Quite a lot about how we deal with like just trying to leave. And I mean, obviously the first most fundamental question is like, is it legitimate for you to be a terrorist? And like that's a question I cannot answer in the next 2 minutes. Because obviously there is a very big debate about the terrorist versus freedom fighter. Like whether or not you consider terrorism bad depends on your perspective. It depends on what side of the fence you have to be on. So like I personally find it very easy to advocate for Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or Hamas in debates, because I think it's easy to construct logical reasons why terrorism might be the only possible available option in the event where you're poor and disenfranchised and no one will listen to you and you don't have any political options and you've attempted to engage in like political discourse often. And so like maybe it is the case that terrorism isn't always wrong. And similarly, if we can justify from that perspective torture, perhaps we can justify things like suicide bombings as like again a utilitarian good that might kill some in hopes of saving many. So like perhaps terrorism isn't objectively wrong, and if you accept that to be true, perhaps it would be inappropriate for the government to prevent you from expressing yourself and becoming a terrorist. Obviously they want to prevent you or attempt to prevent you from committing a crime. But yeah, in the event that we don't know for sure that you're going to commit a crime, we try to detain you in advance. And like a parallel is in the event where we know that you in general are about to commit a crime, we generally don't detain you, right? Very few countries on earth have like preemptive detention for their own citizens. Like again, the United States like kind of an exception there, but and there are exceptions, like someone who is mentally ill and things like that. But generally, we don't preemptively detain people. We only prosecute them after they've committed a crime. And so, you going to join ISIS doesn't necessarily make you a criminal, right? You standing in Syria and saying we hate Christian people, that's not a crime. Obviously, you beheading them is a crime. We don't know surely you're going to do that. So maybe it's inappropriate for us to act in advance. Who knows? Obviously, the threat of ISIS is pretty significant, so it might justify some of these we apply in other circumstances. Okay. Any more questions? No? I'm going to take some that have nothing to do with torture, if you want. You don't really have time to talk through that, so I'll just move on then. Okay, cool. A couple of things I want to say before I let you go then. We've made a slight change in plans. So for anybody who had liked our page on Facebook and was kind of following the updates, tracking tab, we had intended to like kind of put in this week, but because we're still in the process of doing Counterterrorism, we put this together. We are going to be offering this lecture series for the next month for free. So every week we're going to be offering one of these lectures, and you can come and attend totally for free on a bunch of different topics. So I have a flyer which I'll give you, which has information about the 4 upcoming lectures. So next week's lecture will be given by the lovely Saron over here. Many of you know and love, and I'm sure in fact all of you do. So that's exciting. And we'll talk about psychopaths and micro crime, which will be really interesting. The week after that, we're actually importing someone from Singapore. So we're importing the current Asian champion, Aditya, and he is going to come and talk about currency and international trade and a bunch of stuff that I know many of you wrote on the form you have no idea about and you completely suck at, which I can relate to. So he's about to start a job at Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, in currency valuation and stuff like that. So come on to that. And then the week after that, it's going to be Mustafa, who many of you will have heard of well. And he is a complete expert as well. He's going to be talking about taxation and social policy. And then lovely Mai, we're doing the lecture after that. And talking about feminism, and a lot of you wrote that on the form as well and said that was something you weren't confident about at all. So we've attempted, wherever possible, to provide what you're looking for. So I'm going to give you a flyer. You can take them. They give you a bit of bio about the people, but obviously most of you know already. And more importantly, they give you the lecture details. So I'm going to pass this way. Here you go. You can pass them back, and then I'm going to pass them this way. Thank you. Obviously, this one was on a Thursday night, to not inflict